Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you again for joining us and to the workers of our 4 budget groups for organising such an enriching and important convening today. Our final discussion will be on responding to the crisis, experiences and lessons we can learn. My name's Katie Gogley-Swan and I'm the convener of the Scottish Women's Budget Group. And in my day job, I work at the UN focusing on the economics of climate change, a just transition and development across the world's societies. So we're all here because we refuse to accept the injustices and inequality in our societies, and we want to do something about it. This final panel discussion will hopefully bring together the different presentations and discussions we've been having today to bring an eye to the different policy solutions which have been implemented in each devolved nation to address the gendered impacts of the cost of living crisis. As well as hearing from our panel, I want to also make sure that attendees get the opportunity to ask our speakers more about response policies and any future action which should or could be taken. By focusing on solutions and sharing our learnings, we want this session to offer some inspiration and optimism as the cost of living crisis continues to bite, providing a route forward for transforming the lives of women in their communities across the 4 nations. So without further ado, let me introduce our fantastic panel, each of whom will give us 5 minutes of reflections on the impact of the cost of living crisis on women in their nation and the work being done to address it. Our speakers today are Rebecca Evans, MS, Minister for Finance and Local Government, Natalie Dawn, MSP, Convener of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee of the Scottish Parliament, Clare Bailey, former leader of the Green Party of Northern Ireland, and Baroness Ruth of Burtersett, CBE, Member of the House of Lords. To kick us off, I'm going to turn to Minister Rebecca Evans. Rebecca has been the Member of the Senate for Gower since 2016. Since then, she served in a number of ministerial positions, including the Minister for Social Services and Public Health and the Minister for Housing and Regeneration, before joining the Cabinet as Minister for Finance and Trefnath in December 2018. Rebecca has also chaired a number of cross-party groups on social justice issues such as disability, nursing and mental health. In May 2021, Rebecca was appointed Welsh Government Minister for Finance and Local Government. So over to you, Minister.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Good afternoon, or pronounced da. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to join you today and to share with you some of our learning, but also really importantly, to hear how others are tackling the impact of the cost of living crisis on women so that we can take inspiration from each other. So as we came through the pandemic, I think, well, hardly any of us would have imagined that we would find ourselves in the midst of another crisis on the other side. And as with the pandemic, it will be people with protected characteristics and the most vulnerable who are most badly affected by it. And many women are going to bear the brunt of it, both at home, but also, of course, in the workplace. And women with multiple intersecting protected characteristics, I think, will fare even less well. So our response is going to require new interventions as well as building on what we're already doing. So in my own portfolio, I'm responsible for leading our commitment to embed gender budgeting in our budget process. And I've been really grateful for the constructive engagement that we've had with the Icelandic government, with the Canadian government, with Chwarae Teg in Wales and the Welsh Women's Budget Group, and also Angela O'Hagan amongst others. So how are we tackling the cost of living crisis in Wales? Well, it is a real crisis because inflation has eroded our Welsh budget to worryingly low levels. And of course, we know that the UK government now has failed to address that significant funding gap by not lifting our budgets in line with inflation. And that really does mean that the reality is that we can't meet all of the pressures that we've identified with the funding that we have available. But despite this, our 2023-24 draft budget, which I tabled back in December, was designed really to maximise the impact of our available resources. And we've done that by balancing the short-term needs that we see through this crisis, and then also the longer-term change that we need to see in terms of delivering on our programme for government commitments. So this exercise in terms of developing the budget has meant that we've had to review and reprioritise our budget. So looking again at the plans that we had and shifting resources now towards where they're needed most through the cost of living. And as a result of that work, we've been able to invest in a range of measures to help provide targeted and short-term help to help maintain income and to avoid more people being driven into poverty during the crisis. And those build on the actions that we'd already outlined as part of our 3-year spending review last year. And those actions include prioritising support for the Discretionary Assistance Fund. So that's our specific Welsh short-term immediate cash support for people who are facing financial hardship, as well as our pupil deprivation grant, pupil development grant. Now it's been renamed, and that really is focusing financial support to schools where we have more children from less well-off households to ensure that they can all achieve their potential. And also our work in terms of homelessness prevention as well. So in terms of the structures for this, we formed a cabinet subcommittee to bring together people with lived experiences, experts, service providers, and organisations who are supporting people who are already struggling financially so that they can engage directly with ministers, and we can sit and listen to people who are on the front line. And we had a really powerful session listening to young people who were really facing the cost of living crisis and what it meant for them and their families. And that that kind of direct conversation, I think, really helps in terms of helping us prioritise our funding, our policies. Lots of our support will benefit everyone, but of course there are areas where women are disproportionately affected, so they will have a greater benefit from our interventions. Examples of some of the action that we're taking include providing support to parents with the cost of the school day, and we've also significantly now increased the eligibility for free school meals in Wales. We're also providing additional funding to tackle food poverty and are increasing our period dignity grant, and that's in response to the crisis, to make sure that products are available as widely as possible, and we're now including schools and colleges in that as well. And of course, we provide support for household costs through our council tax support, heating support, and also support for those who are on prepayment meters. So those are some of the steps that we're taking to tackle the crisis, alongside our kind of longer term programme for government commitments, such as our childcare offer and the support for the real living wage for social care workers. And those things are also helping us tackle some of the deep-rooted inequalities that women face, as well as supporting them through the crisis. So despite the really difficult context, we're maintaining our commitment to prioritise the most vulnerable and prioritise public services, whilst continuing with our real focus on creating that stronger, fairer and greener Wales that we all want to see. So thank you very much. Looking forward to hearing the contributions and having the discussion.
Thank you so much, Minister Evans. To keep us moving, I'll go on to our next speaker, who's going to be Natalie Dawn, who is an SNP MSP for Renfrewshire North and West since 2021. Her previous roles have included being a member in the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee, as well as member and deputy convener of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee, before being appointed convener of this committee. The screen is yours, Natalie.
Sorry, didn't start off great. Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you for having me along. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. And equally really thankful to be given the experience of Scotland. So we know that similarly to Rebecca before, we know that women in Scotland have been disproportionately impacted by the cost of living crisis. I'll look at a few specific matters. So taking, for example, the energy crisis first, women in Scotland make up the majority of groups with higher energy needs, such as older people, disabled people, unpaid carers, and those looking after children in the home. We also know that women are in the majority of part-time or zero-hour contracts. Analysis also has suggested that women are more likely to take responsibility for spending on children within the home and purchasing items, so like food and domestic products. And given the rise in inflation, we all know how much these simple items have increased by. Within Scotland, women are also the majority of those on universal credit and therefore impacted by the benefit cap. And just looking at another aspect as well, in terms of domestic abuse, the cost of living crisis has just provided another barrier to leaving abusive households due to financial implications. So 73% of women recently who are experiencing domestic abuse, said that the cost of living crisis has prevented them from leaving that household or would make it harder for them to do so. And this is really worrying because this comes at a time, we've just had the pandemic where women were physically unable to leave these households, and now we've got these extra financial barriers. So I think that's something that really needs to be focused on going forward as well. In terms of what the Scottish Government are doing, so again, this covers a lot of areas, so I'm going to try and focus on those making the biggest impact in my eyes. So £3 billion was allocated to mitigate the impacts of the cost of living crisis. But again, with a limited budget and no borrowing powers, we are limited in what we can do. But I think there's some really unique things that we have put forward. So, for example, the Scottish Child Payment is a payment that is completely unique to Scotland. That gives eligible families on low income £25 per week for children between 5 and 16. Now, that payment began at £10 and it was recently uprated to £25 per week back in November as a direct result of the cost of living crisis. So that's putting money into families and households. So Scotland also devolved social security benefits by 10.1% in line with inflation. And there's a whole other range of social security measures that as I say, Scotland or those that Scotland can impact. So bridging payments have been doubled to £260 for low income families, the provision of free school meals for primary 1s to 5s, and the expansion of that to primary 6s and 7s. We put more money into the fuel insecurity fund, we've boosted carers allowance. But I think as well as these social security measures, there are other policies that Scotland has already been doing that are directly benefiting women and families. So, for example, the 1140-hour expansion of childcare to 3 and 4 year olds free childcare has massively helped, I think, households. There's also plans for a wraparound childcare service. The Scottish Government provides free bus travel for many people in those groups, so disabled people, people under 22, children and all those over 60. And women also have access to free prescriptions here in Scotland. And given some of the things that we've been talking about nationally recently, menopause and things like that have been getting more and more, thankfully, more emphasis, then that's again something that benefits women here in Scotland. So in terms of my own remit in the Social Justice and Social Security Committee, we are currently undertaking an inquiry on child poverty and parental employability. And the aim of that is to find out how the Scottish Government could support parents into better employment opportunities. And within that, we're looking at specific groups such as women under 25 or single parent households, because we know that it's generally it's more often women. So we know that women are disproportionately impacted in terms of the labour market, as I referred to earlier. So in terms of tackling poverty, increasing employment opportunities is going to be absolutely key to that. But for me, I mean, it's not just about finding any job, it's about finding something suitable that works for you, works around your childcare responsibilities. Women may require flexibility upon returning to work after having a baby. So although the inquiry is still in really early days, we've carried out visits to local employability projects and we've spoke to women with lived experience, women on low incomes, and the similar things are getting raised. So lack of appropriate childcare, barriers to access and education, lack of suitable employment, issues with transport, education. And we're going to start taking evidence in that over the coming months, but we're hoping that that builds a wider picture of what is required to support these women and how, what recommendations we can then make to the Scottish Government to provide further support in these areas on top of what I've already discussed. So I think I've been rattling on for a while, but just last thing I wanted to say is I think, where do we go from here? Because I think we're going to have similar stories from everyone. And I think there's steps we can take in terms of policy, but these issues shine a real light on the fact that we're still nowhere near true gender equality in spheres like the home, the workplace, and childcare. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today and hearing the input from other panelists and the questions afterwards. And I hope that was an all right roundup. It
was more than all right, and you weren't rattling at all. Thank you very much, Natalie. And as you said, some common themes coming through. And to move us along, let's hear from Clare. Clare Bailey is the former leader of the Green Party of Northern Ireland. In her time as an MLA, she was a champion of equality, particularly gender equality and climate justice. And this was reflected in her legislation, the most recent of which was the Abortion Services Safe Access Zones Bill, the Domestic Abuse Safe Leave Bill, and the inclusion of gender equality in the Climate Change Bill, all issues close to my heart. Over to you, Clare.
Thanks very much. And I'm a wee bit jealous just listening to Natalie and Rebecca there. I wish I had some good news to tell you, but we are in Northern Ireland without an executive yet again and no sitting assembly. So work is not getting done yet again. So I was sort of really thinking about what I would say today, and the phrase broken Britain kept coming up an awful lot, and that's something that we do here. And I just want to put out that, you know, I'm from the belief that the system is not broken. The system was built this way, and that's what we're all living within the context of. So thinking about today and what my contribution would be, I really had to start by asking myself, what is the cost of living for women, and where and when did it start? Because we can't begin to solve the problems and the issues if we continue to ignore the root causes, and that is the patriarchy. Now, we've been living with that cost for centuries in all its invariable shape-shifting that has gone on. So when we look at crisis, well, just even over most recent years, we have had and continue to have so many. So we've had the economic and the banking crisis, for example, and we've seen how that was resolved. We have mental health crisis here in Northern Ireland just this weekend alone. I'm being told of a 10-year-old living very close by me who is in emergency care right now after attempting her fourth suicide attempt, for example, and still no care package put in place for this child. We have a health crisis, and let's not forget that nurses in Northern Ireland went on strike for the first time in their history before COVID and lockdowns even hit us. We have the poverty crisis, which continues unabated. We have a homicide and domestic violence crisis. The stats in Northern Ireland are among the highest in the world. Of course, COVID and the pandemic crisis, political crisis that we in Northern Ireland are so used to, but we're now seeing within the UK government as well. Energy crisis, we're being told we're paying extortionate prices, yet oil and gas companies' profits are soaring beyond, you know, record highs that they've ever seen, while at the same time we're seeing a green industrial revolution that we're being told will bring down our bills. But where are women in all this? And of course, then the crisis of all crisis is the climate crisis upon us as well. So when we look at all this, we are in perpetual crisis without the policies to really get to the root of the causes to what will make lives better, rather than tinkering around the edges and begging for the breadcrumbs off the tables. And thankfully, because of the excellent work that is ongoing and research that has been done, we do know the problems and we know the gendered nature of the impacts. And regardless of any other demographics that might be applied, whether that be race, disability, class, sexuality, women always suffer disproportionately. This we know, and we've known for a long time. So for me, the missing link is the political will and the bravery to make the changes. And just one pretty straightforward example to use here would be the gender pay gap, for example. We wouldn't still have this if the political will to sort it out was there. Childcare is another one, and they've heard it mentioned quite a number of times today as well. So when we do know the problem, when we do have the evidence, and when we continue to suffer the continued brutal impacts of a worsening context, exactly what can be done? Do we keep producing the same? And here in Northern Ireland, for example, the Women's Resource and Development Agency, they've produced an economic paper called the Feminist Recovery Plan, and that was a few years back, and it received minimal political attention, and just, you know, within the parties or the Assembly itself. And they actually produced an updated version, you know, and again got even less political attention. But there are the basics, very straightforward, common sense approach to how we can do better and how we can make the changes. And during the last mandate, when I was elected, I was chair of our Northern Ireland Assembly's Women's Caucus for a while, and we were trying to push good work through there as well, we were trying to bring a motion on gender budgeting for debate, but we were timed out of the mandate and weren't able to even have that debate heard and to raise these issues. But there were a few wins, and thanks for mentioning a few there, Katie, as well. But even just during the climate bill that we did get passed, the Climate Act now as it is for Northern Ireland, we did get the just transition principles embedded within that act. We also got gender proofing embedded within that bill as well. But still, it's just not enough. Again, I don't see where we're going to really move this if we don't address the root causes. So if you're asking me, I see a great need to up the ante and to act outside of this, what I call a cyclical hamster wheel, and do something differently. And rather than, as I say, beg for the crumbs of tinkering around policies, and the small, and I know they're really, really important, and I don't mean small as in minimal, but within that wider, bigger picture, the wins that we do get and then have to continually defend within that bigger, we're always just swamped, you know. So I really feel that there's an urgent and immediate need for deep and radical change, that I genuinely believe it's time to add more strings to our bows, and we'll have to have those conversations about what we can do, because I see no pathway to change from political systems that we have that will bring us what's actually needed. For me, solutions need to start laying in direct action, and that direct action can look like many, many things. For example, we hear about this energy revolution. Why are we not organizing ourselves to put solar panels on houses of the most vulnerable? It's not rocket science, it's pretty straightforward technology that can be managed. Why are we not doing that? Why are we allowing the big oil and gas companies to own this infrastructure and sell us back the sun, the moon, and the stars at extortionate prices? And what about our food supplies? How can we not just change local food supplies as well, get this action up and going? And I just am very, very passionate as well. Let's look to Iceland in the 70s. Let's look at the women's strike that happened there, and let's start talking about how we do our own. Everybody's on strike. We're going through a year of discontent, and who knows what lies beyond that. But let's call women out on strike, and let's start to understand the value of ourselves and our labour. And I'm happy to talk to anybody present who maybe wants to continue on that conversation. But none of it will solve everything that we need to address. But I do believe the huge change is coming with climate change, that we need to organise and mobilise ourselves differently and to mitigate as best as we can to what's coming down the line, regardless of where we are right now.
Thank you so much, Claire, and for bringing in this systemic recognition of the connections of the misogynism in our societies with these larger intersecting crises. You know, I think that, you know, we understand as feminists the way that women's labour and women's contribution to society is often seen or understood as a freebie, as a subsidy that is hidden. And similarly, our climate and our natural environment is also treated as such, treated as something that can be exploited endlessly. And I think those kind of systemic connections are what a feminist lens really brings. So thank you for that. And moving on then, oh, and one other thing I just wanted to say, just as Claire was inspiring me there, is, you know, you mentioned Broken Britain, and I think yesterday the IMF came out with its new economic outlook sort of assessment of the world's economies. Not that the IMF is the most respected institution for more progressive economics, but the UK was the only of the advanced economies that is still facing a really negative year. And I think that that is something that, you know, that global context where, you know, there's a global cost of living crisis, which is affecting everybody, including the women in our four nations. But the fact that, you know, there is this feeling of running on a treadmill on the spot, while, you know, the policy environment is not supporting these developed nations to do what they have to do. So to hear a little bit more about the English context, I now turn to Ruth Lister. Ruth is Emeritus Professor of Social Policy at Loughborough University and a Labour peer. She served on the Commission on Social Justice, the Upsall Commission into the Future of Northern Ireland, the Commission on Poverty, Participation and Power, the Fabian Commission on Life Chances and Child Poverty, and the National Equality Panel. She's a founding academician of the Academy for Learning Societies for the Social Sciences and was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 2009. Baroness Lister received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Social Policy Association in 2010. She's a former director of the Child Poverty Action Group and is now its honorary president. Ruth was a member of the Parliamentary Joint Committee for Human Rights from 2012 to 2015 and is the chair of the Management Committee of Compass. The screen is yours, Ruth.
Okay, thank you. I was hoping you wouldn't read out so much. Claire started by saying how she was jealous of Natalie and Rebecca, and I'd written down envy on my notes that because I think for all the brilliant work that the Women's Budget Group has done, there's a lack of real awareness, and certainly in the Westminster government. And then this, we don't. I'm not talking about Westminster as opposed to England, because we don't have an English government as such. Lack of real awareness of the gendered impact of the cost of living crisis. For all that women are, we have heard, disproportionately at risk, and also typically bear the burden of managing poverty and act as its shock absorbers. And I'm sorry I couldn't be here for the earlier sessions, where I'm sure that was all kind of coloured in with much more detail. I'm going to focus on incomes, and as ministers will constantly tell you whenever you raise issues in this area, they have implemented a cost of living package made up of the energy bill support scheme, cost of living payments for those on eligible means tested benefits, disability benefits and pensions, both 22-23 and 23-24, extension till March 24 of the discretionary local authority household support fund, and the inflation uprating of benefits in April, and also for the first time of the benefit cap rates. Now, of course, this is welcome, but there is a big series of buts. First of all, those reliant on Social Security, as we've heard, many of whom are women, are having to live on benefits that are uprated by 3.1% last April, which amounts to a significant cut in their real value, just when the cost of living crisis is hitting hardest, on top of cuts and freezes since 2010. And it's even worse when one considers that inflation is higher for those on low income, because they spend just a much bigger proportion of their income on the basics, food and fuel, which have been going up fastest in price. Now, the government has argued that it's too difficult technically to bring forward the benefit uprating, or to uprate benefits more than once in a year, as many have been calling for, and that the one-off payments compensate. But, again, a steady stream of money is widely seen as more helpful from the perspective both of budgeting and providing security than one-off payments. The local housing allowance remains frozen, and the increase in the benefit cap, which was very welcome, doesn't take account of inflation since 2016, when the rates were set. So according to our library, who did the calculation for me, there's still, the benefit rate is still 9.8% lower in real terms, the benefit cap, than it was when these rates were introduced in 2016. One-off cost of living payments, means tested living payments, exclude those who happen not to be received a qualifying benefit at the specified time, even if they're on that benefit for most of the winter. And this includes those who are in receipt of universal credit, but who don't receive it at the specified time because of the vagaries of how universal credit interacts with wages, which is a whole issue in its own right. No account is taken of family size, even though children are disproportionately at risk of poverty. And I really am envious of Scotland and what you've been doing for children there, but also Wales, actually, in terms of school meals and so forth. Nothing on school meals here. Carers are excluded unless they receive universal credit, yet Carers UK has shown a significant number in this position are suffering considerable hardship. In addition, those who move on to universal credit in the run-up to April, to the uprating, they may find that if they're worse off on universal credit than they were on legacy benefit, that they lose their transitional protection because the uprating will either wipe it out completely or partially wipe it out. So there's a real premium on not going on to universal credit until after the uprating, if you can possibly help it. And Joseph Brownchief Foundation pointed to a significant number of low incomes who aren't receiving the means tested benefits to which they're entitled, and therefore benefit from neither the uprating nor the cost of living payment. And inevitably with means tested benefits, there's a cliff edge where you know, £1 too much and that's it, you don't qualify. And the government's response, whenever these kinds of flaws are pointed out in the current approach, they say, well, the people affected can get help from the Household Support Fund. But this help is from local authorities, discretionary, it's cash limited, and it's what I call the loaves and fishes approach to social policy. So despite welcome government action, many women, especially mothers and carers, will be suffering even more hardship than usual this winter. But as we've been asked to provide a ray of optimism, and other speakers have done so as well, it does seem as if the sheer awfulness of the current situation may have increased political and public awareness of the poverty, including deep poverty, that many are suffering. And I'm sure it was thanks to political pressure that the government didn't junk the inflation proofing of benefits this April in favour of raising them in line with wages, which was widely reported could well happen. So we need to build on that, focus attention on the underlying inadequacies of the social security system and the way that it's exacerbating rather than preventing poverty and insecurity. And as they show, the experience of the £20 uplift showed, policy can make a real difference. I mean, during the pandemic, some people were better off than they would normally be because of that temporary £20 uplift. So as the gravitational pull of the general election starts to be felt, we need to ensure that women's poverty and economic insecurity is a key issue for all the political parties. Involve, as I think as Rebecca said, those with lived experience in the debates around what should happen. And as Claire said, yes, it's really a matter of political will, and we need to ensure that the other side of the general election, the political will is there to do something, not just tinker, but do something more systemic, as you have said. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And your point there about raising awareness. I also noticed this week the BBC, an independent review was published of the BBC's coverage of issues such as taxation, public spending and government borrowing and debt output, which showed that there was a heavy bias in the BBC's coverage of these issues, which has been shaping public opinion in a way that doesn't really fully understand what a more progressive economic approach to some of these issues would be. So hopefully, as well as raising awareness about about the realities of poverty, we are also going to see a sea change in how some of these issues are reported to be more based in a sound economics rather than in the talking points of a few think tanks in London. But on that point, on your point of optimism, one question for you to get us started is, current polling points towards Labour winning the next general election. So if that does turn out to be right, what do you think Labour's priorities should be, particularly for addressing the impact of the cost of living crisis on women?
Well, I've made clear that my priorities aren't necessarily what will happen, but I think, to be fair, Labour's going to face an incredibly difficult situation. Because I don't want to be too party political about it, but we are in an economic, well, the IFS has made clear we're in an economic mess. I think it has to take short-term measures immediately. In particular, abolish the benefit cap, abolish the two-child limit. Now, I know in Northern Ireland there are mitigations, at least for the benefit cap, which has helped a lot. Unfreeze the local housing allowance. I think they have to rethink. I mean, not necessarily. Doesn't worry me if they talk about fundamental reform or scrapping universal credit. I think in some ways it's better to reform it properly, because I think it's actually very disruptive for people in receipt of a benefit if it's constantly being changed at a level. You know, 1 minute it's universal credit, the next minute it's something else. But they've got to address the inflexibilities, which I don't know if Fran Bennett's on this call, but she and Jane Miller have helped draw attention to, which combine to to lead to the 5-week wait, which is clearly a real problem, and then gets people into debt because they are encouraged to take out an advance payment, which is then taken away from their subsequent benefit, so they're pushed below what are already inadequate benefit levels. And then in the longer term, I think I would argue that the need to signal at the outset that they are going to do a much more fundamental reform of Social Security in the longer term, to reduce reliance on means testing, to ensure that benefits are adequate to ensure a decent life. But that, you know, I have to be realistic. That's not going to, they're not going to be able to do that immediately. But at least they should give people hope that that is where they want to go. So that's, I mean, only talking about Social Security. I mean, there are a lot of other things, childcare. Actually, they have already said quite a lot about what will happen on childcare. And I think that's encouraging, because that is clearly a priority for the party. But it worries me when, you know, poverty isn't perhaps being treated with and women's poverty in particular, but poverty more generally, with the seriousness that it needs to be for the future.
Thanks, Ruth. So we are now moving into our Q&A session. So I do want to invite our audience to put your questions into the Q&A, and hopefully we'll be able to get round to them. And I already see a few that have been added there. But to get us started, I'm going to ask our speakers if you have looked at some of the things that the other nations have been doing to respond to the crisis at home, and how you see, it's already been mentioned by a few speakers, particularly from Rebecca and Natalie, but the role of lived experience within communities to help inform decision making. How do you see that contributing to better designing policy to respond to the cost of living issues? So to get us started, I'll go back to Minister Evans.
Great, thank you. So we're really clear that the best decisions are those which are based, you know, driven by good data, and that includes, you know, empirical data, but it also includes the kind of discussions that we have with individuals. So we've set up equality, race and disability evidence units, and those units are really tasked with ensuring that we understand where the gaps are in the evidence, and also in terms of any inconsistencies that we're seeing in evidence, to try and get under those and understand them. And so part of that work really is engaging with people with lived experiences. And to make sure that we do this as part of our budget process, we've set up a budget improvement plan, which is a 5-year rolling plan, which sets out how we will always constantly try and improve the way in which we undertake our budgeting processes and listen to people. And again, talking and engaging with people with lived experiences is a really important part of that. But in terms of dealing with the immediate crisis, as I mentioned, we've got a cabinet subcommittee where we literally sit with people with lived experiences. So I mentioned the young people session that we did to hear from them, and you know, that's just more powerful than anything you can read in, you know, statistics or any other kind of format. Just hearing young people talking about the worries that they have about the impact it's having on their family life, you know, being too afraid to ask for, you know, their parents for things because they don't want to upset them, and feeling embarrassed then in school if they haven't got the same as other kids. You know, all of these things, just hearing them directly from those young people has been so powerful. So, you know, we need then to be able to show these young people that we've acted on what they've said. So the work that we're doing on expanding free school meals is really important. So we aim to get those out to all people in young people and children in primary school, and we're looking to see what more we can do in that space as well. So just being able then to go back to those young people and said, because you told us of your experience, we've made these changes, I think is really important. Otherwise they will feel that they wasted their time and that politicians aren't listening to them, which is not what we want to be doing.
Thank you, Rebecca. And you know, that importance of accountability and being able to, you know, say with honesty the response and the way that you're listening to your constituents and turning that into action. Over to Natalie now about that question of like how lived experience contributes to policy, but I also have a couple of questions specifically for you in the chat. The first one is on from a couple of folk who are interested in the issue facing parents who work in low paid part-time work, who are often ineligible for a lot of the different protections that the Scottish Government have implemented. Is there a chance that your committee is going to be looking at some of these thresholds to try and address those gaps? And then a second question came in around what support is being provided to women who may be with no other choice, you know, working in sex work in order to have some income, not because they want to be a sex worker, but because they don't have another choice. Is the Scottish Government doing anything around that? So a few questions for you there, Natalie, to tackle.
Thanks. Yeah, I saw them in the chat and I thought it's best to just wait until I'm on screen to try and answer them. So I'll start with the first question. So in terms of like lived experience, so yeah, I mentioned it in my opening. Our committee has put a real emphasis on speaking to people with lived experience. So we've carried that out within this inquiry, and we have just completed a low income and debt inquiry, which looked at the state of things across Scotland and made recommendations to all levels of government, so local authorities, Scottish and UK governments. And we spoke to people with lived experience in that. We've also spoke to people with lived experience in a short inquiry we did on kinship care, because as I say, there's no point in people sitting behind this making policies when we're not speaking to people on the ground that are experiencing these matters. And as I say, we've put a real emphasis on that in our committee, but in terms of things like tackling poverty, this goes across a whole different range of policy matters and different departments in government. So we're really encouraging all the committees and just encouraging more of that work in Parliament in general. In terms of the Parliament itself, because I think that's really important, like lived experience for your parliamentarians is really important. And within the Scottish Government, I mean, we have one of the most diverse parliaments we've had. So people that have been through different issues that are setting policy agendas. We've got more women ministers, more women cabinet secretaries, more disabled people, you know. So, and I mean, in my own experience, I've kind of made it clear that, I mean, I come from a different background to what your kind of average usual politician comes from. I grew up in a difficult home. I left school at a young age. I was on benefits when I was younger. I was in part-time work. So I think it's really important that we've got people like that, as I say, behind me setting that policy agenda. Moving on to the question about employability and the issues with being able to access different benefits. So I absolutely expect that that's something that's about to come up in this inquiry that we're doing on parental employability. As I say, this, I think I cut that little bit out of my opening. This is still in the very early days. At the moment, we've just done those visits and we're about to launch a call for views, which I would encourage you all when that opens to take part in that. And that will set a clearer scene of who we're then going to ask in for our evidence sessions, and that will be a range of different kind of support organisations and groups and different third sector organisations. So I absolutely expect that to come up as an issue because it's solely focused on that kind of employability side of it. And I think it kind of comes back to what I was saying in the opening about suitable employment, because we're not just wanting women in any employment. It has to be worthwhile at the end of the day. You know, we know we've got all these extra costs to add on, so transport and childcare, and if you're on a part-time or a low wage, then there's a fine balance there as to how much money you're actually taking home at the end of the day after all these expenses. So the whole point in this inquiry is to try and ensure that the Scottish Government are supporting women into higher paid work, better employment, opportunities that suit them more and are going to benefit more. In terms of the cap, I mean, I've already said that the Scottish budget is extremely limited, and I don't think I need to emphasise the constraints on it. And in terms of these extra payments, it is a real help, but I understand that there's people out there that aren't eligible. So I hope that the work that we're about to do in the inquiry will hopefully impact that, if that does come through as a real issue, which I'm sure it will. In terms of the question around sex work, so it was in the programme for government that we were a commitment to develop a model that would improve this for women. Now that's kind of on the grander scheme of things, and that's still in the process. I don't think there's been an update on that, but it's the whole idea around that was to kind of reduce stigma and criminalisation experienced by women in that work and encourage better access to services, and there has been increased funding to support services such as this. So that is something that I think is currently being worked on. In terms of the cost of living crisis, I think it harps back to what I've kind of been talking about. Poverty is the real issue here. Women shouldn't be being forced into this. And that's what I want to put an end to. I want to put an end to women even having to make these decisions in the first place. So I hope that covers everything, but I see some comments on the side.
Well, while you're reading that, we'll move on to Clare. And while during your response, Clare, we also got another question on just transition, which I know I sit on the Just Transition Commission of the Scottish Government, so I know about the Scottish environment, but it would be great to hear your perspective about the role of gender mainstreaming or feminist priorities in a just transition, as well as responding to that question around lived experience, and maybe reflecting too about what does it look like from where you are responding to a cost of living crisis without a government.
Thanks very much. I get really quite animated and excited about just transition. I know not everybody will, it's a bit of a geekery one, but for me, this is getting right down into providing an opportunity for real change. Okay, so we have on our systems an awful lot of the time top-down heavy approach, where you've got the policy makers and the decision makers at that high level, which is needed, of course, but the disassociation with, I suppose, grassroots or community level can sometimes be quite vast. With me, the just transition principles are about that real deep down and dirty engagement, I suppose, at a grassroots level. And I'm involved with a project. It is from a think tank in Dublin. And what they are doing, they've done a few pilot studies. I just think it's exciting for anybody that's in there. And from those pilots, they're now running out 30 projects right across the island. Quite a lot of them will be in the north with us. And we're going to be doing pilot projects the pilots are done. We're going to be doing projects with local communities about what they would like to see. What does a just transition look like for them? Because there's no one model fits all, because the response to where people are right now, where communities are right now, and where they need to be will be very, very different. And along with that, what's absolutely essential is about mapping out their resource and their infrastructure, their capacity, and what they've already got. And then having a chat with them about where do you need to be, where would you like to be, and building those pathways. And I think that when you get down and have those conversations at local levels with local communities, you'll see the common threads, of course, and people want basic security, such as, health and housing, education, they're all coming out. But then you've got rural and urban, maybe coastal and, inland communities with very different resources. So what they can provide for the future in terms of job creation or, moving into industry and securing populations is very, very different. And I think that that's where the real excitement comes. So when we look at the UK climate action plans, I suppose at the minute, and even the work coming from the UK CCC, again, it's based on this notion that the UK is this single entity, without acknowledging even that Northern Ireland is a separate landmass. So, even setting those types of targets, we were given an 82% carbon budget or carbon target, so we weren't even being allowed to go for net zero and be that ambitious. I was being called morally reprehensible by the chair of the UK CCC for pushing for net zero, which I did get, thank goodness that they're now working with this, but like Scotland did as well. I think you were given 95% target and moved to set your own. But these things are really important when you get down at that very local level. So when you start to engage with women at that local level, when you start to look at education, childcare, poverty, food, energy, jobs, all of that there, when you talk at that level, I think that's where Just Transition gets really, really exciting. And I hope that I haven't just turned that into a big garble, but it is local, it is transitionary, and it is future proofing. And I think when we have those plans at that local level, I think that gives permission maybe to elected office, maybe the politicians and political parties, to say that this is okay. This is what your local communities want, and you have a responsibility to represent that. And I think that it redresses that maybe that imbalance about the top-down approach and makes it a bottom-up permissive level of decision making.
Thank you, Claire. And then I'll turn to Ruth. And Ruth, I think there's a question for yourself and maybe also Rebecca to respond to about how Labour considers or values the care economy and investment in social infrastructure as part of a critical economic strategy to target women's inequality. Is this I suppose the question, if I remember correctly, I have to scroll all the way up, is there do you feel like that it's valued enough, and maybe also offering advice on where it could go next, or how to better integrate those things into a policy approach. So yeah, the question about that, and then also about lived experience. One other question maybe to throw into the mix that I've seen is, with the mention of a potential general election, and I think some are considering that it might be in 2024, so that's fairly soon. One question that has came up in the chat is around campaigning and restrictions in campaigning. We've seen obviously, challenges to civil society space to be able to campaign on certain issues. If there is advice on strategies there that feminists can take to be able to organise and raise awareness on these issues more substantially during any election period.
Oh, there's a lot there. On the care infrastructure, I'm not sure, to be honest. I mean, I think the emphasis being placed on childcare even implicitly gets that point, because the way it's being presented and that partly about sort of part of economic strategy. But I think anyone who's on the call who's a member of the Labour Party, now is the time to try and influence thinking through the National Policy Forum consultation, which started this week. It's being done, it's not for individuals to respond this time. It's going to be done through constituency Labour parties and through stakeholder groups. So, I mean, I very much hope the Women's Budget Group is going to be putting in evidence to that there are, I think, 5 different consultations going on. So it might be quite a bit of work putting into all of them. Actually, I'm on the one that includes childcare, but I think the more general point about social infrastructure being part of economic policy needs to be put into the sort of economic policy group. So certainly it's a point that I know, I mean, I'm a member of the Women's Parliamentary Labour Party, and it's a point we have made, other women in the Parliamentary Labour Party, women MPs have made at meetings to shadow ministers. So I think it's understood. It's perhaps just not always explicit as it might be, and could be made more explicit and more central. In terms of lived experience, I mean, I cited a lot the Scottish example in terms of involving people with lived experience of social security in developing social security policy, both those who are recipients and those who are working in the system. I mean, both have really important perspectives they can bring. And in my own work my academic work on poverty, when you introduced me, you mentioned I was a member of the Commission on Participation and Power, and half of that commission were people with direct experience of poverty. and I learned so much from it, and it kind of so influenced the way I then wrote my book on poverty. And I believe it's absolutely crucial, both in terms of what other panelists have talked about who are more involved in policy making perhaps themselves, in terms of effective policy, but also if one, as I do, believe that a human rights approach should be taken to poverty, and then it's kind of central to that acknowledging, recognizing the agency, the value of the lived experience of people in poverty. In terms of campaigning, I mean, I don't really have any kind of answers. I mean, it is an issue. I don't know whether there are lessons. I mean, I think it would be good to try and learn some lessons from the last election. What happened then? You know, what were the pitfalls? How did people get round the restrictions? Because it would be dreadful if, you know, voices of the kind of groups who are represented here simply don't get heard because of that. But I don't have the answer, I'm afraid. Thank
you, Ruth. Well, we are running out of time, and I do want to mention a few other things that people have put in the chat. So one of the attendees has mentioned, you know, the connection to violence against women and girls, when there is, you know, economic inequalities and the precarious situations that can lead to. And there's also been a mention too around, from Professor Diane Nelson, around monetary policy, which sort of relates to that point around the recent report on the BBC's reporting of economic issues. You know, we hear, you know, we need to raise rates, but not really thinking about what that means in terms of like the economic output on women and vulnerable people. So just to make sure that those are raised so that the panelists don't lose those. But I'm going to exploit my position as chair and ask my own final question to all panelists. You know, we are here, the 4 women's budget groups of the UK, and if you had to give us one piece of advice for moving forward in 2023, for advancing, you know, you've heard a little bit about our objectives and our ambitions, you know, what would you give us as a piece of advice? Just one piece of advice each, and we'll go in reverse order. So Ruth, I'm sorry, I'm going to go straight back to you.
I don't know. I mean, I am a member of the women's budget. And in fact, should have said I am a member of the women's budget group. So I just not try and give advice to. I honestly don't know. I think I perhaps just keep on doing, but perhaps more loudly, the way that key issues are gendered. I mean, I've just been reading the Resolution Foundation's account of living standards, and there is not one mention of gender differences in that. It's quite good on race and ethnic differences, but nothing about gender. So I think there's still a lot to be done to put gender at the heart of all the conversations. Sorry, that's a bit of a cop-out.
Not a cop-out at all. We know there's a lot of work to be done. Claire, yourself?
Thanks very much. A wee bit of time to think there, but I know the great work goes on already. But in the context of following on from the general election, potential campaigning coming up, I know that there's excellent work goes on with, you know, not just the Women's Budget Group here in Northern Ireland, but also WRDA as well, and they come up with a feminist manifesto for every election, and that really breaks down into bite-sized, easy peasy, you know, sort of bite-sized pieces for people. So break down what's being asked for across the 4 nations, make sure that it gets out there to people to hold their representatives, because they'll not be elected just yet, to account, and take a leaf out of the Tories books, by the way. So when you're coming up to your campaigning, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, you know, regardless of the actions. When they try and outlaw us all, you know, they break their own laws and then ask for permission later, and we all give it. So let's adopt that Tory model, break it down into bite-sized pieces, come up with a feminist manifesto, and let's get some good results.
If we had £27 million to hide, Claire, I think we'd be having this in a different kind of environment. Natalie, yourself?
Yeah, I guess it's a hard question, but I guess it would be just don't hold back and continue the good work that you are doing. And as I say, emphasis on the don't hold back. As a young, relatively new women politician, I have to tell myself that on a daily basis, because there are still a lot of barriers that we face. And I think that we need to keep women's issue. We need to not keep, because some are growing, but we need to put more women's issues at the top of the agenda, because, as I say, I've been surprised by some of the barriers that I've faced, and on the experience that we hear from women, as I say, through working in the Parliament, that there are still so many barriers out there. So we need you to keep fighting that cause and keep raising these issues in the kind of appropriate channels. So yeah, don't hold back would be my advice.
Thank you, Natalie. And last word goes to Rebecca.
I would just say start really soon, because as you say, the general election could happen at any time. And one thing that as a politician you see is, as soon as the general election is called, you get lots and lots of organisations sending you their manifestos. But the time to do that really is like a year before the general election, when we're starting to formulate our manifestos ourselves. So that's the way to get your policies into those manifestos. And then just speak the same language as the people you're trying to influence. So there'll be politicians who are really passionate about climate change, about transport or skills, but then talk to them and say, well, hang on a second, do you know there's a gender issue here as well? And just try and raise awareness and open their horizons on the issues that they're already interested in, just from a different perspective.
So we've got our work cut out for us, in other words. So I'm going to stop here. We're running 1 minute over time, but thank you to all of our speakers on this panel and all the other panels that have been involved today for giving up your time to be part of our event. Thank you also to all the attendees for joining us and sticking with us to this point. Hopefully you've learned something new and have been inspired. And thank you to all of the workers in the women's budget groups for their organisation of today. As has been mentioned, we live in a time of overlapping and intersecting crises, and it can be really difficult to know where to start when we so desperately need to change. Events or convenings like these bring us together. We can seek common cause and we can strategize a way forward. We've heard speakers today, talking about the sheer scale of the crisis that we're facing, and particularly, vulnerable women in the communities across their nations, but also about our determination to help those who are at the sharpest end of these rising costs and the manifold root causes. I hope everyone today has been inspired to continue the fight, to redouble our efforts and to continue to come together in a spirit of solidarity to eradicate injustices and inequalities across our nations. So on that note, thank you very much and have a lovely afternoon and evening.
Thank you.